Thank you, Madalena, and thanks everyone for listening in. So to point out, I mean, this is a conference about regulation, and I am not a lawyer. I am an ethnographer, so I study the kind of social and cultural dynamics of decentralized technology communities. And so, first of all, I would point out that the concept of decentralization in this setting is not just an architectural one, it's really a political one as well. So, I have sort of quotes in my research about, political aims via technological means. So there's sort of ideological undertones, and the previous panel, touched on that a little bit about libertarianism, although I'd say that decentralized technology communities are much broader and more heterogeneous than just that as a political leaning. But these ideas and subcultures influence the concept of decentralization and how that's expressed and what's actually seen as aspirationally important and also kind of practically viable. And so what the policy idea of sufficiently decentralized conveys into that sort of context is really that, something potentially exists, which is quote unquote decentralized in some manner in terms of like not having the external political influence, but that also complies with the law. And so that's, I think, a really important edge to explore in this conversation, because the risks and the fear of liability is a massive barrier to founders that want to. Can I just jump in on that? Because there's a very pertinent and timely question here about where the boundaries of decentralized digital organizations actually exist. And that's with this recent trend for communities such as DAOs to constitute themselves. And so I should say I do a bit of work with Block Science, which is an engineering firm in the space. And we just put out a Medium post a couple of weeks ago with my colleague Michael Zargam and Eric Alston called "What Constitutes a Constitution?" And we're sort of posing this idea that the boundaries of decentralized organizations exist both in the legal wrapper that they might choose, as well as in the social documentation, like a manifesto or something that they write about who they are, that people sign with their wallet, as well as in the protocol itself. So it's this idea that because they're digital and digitally native organizations, they have this kind of constitutional infrastructure that they compose different elements of across the social, the technical, the legal, and so on. And I think the really pertinent open question here is like, what are the actual legal consequences of DAOs, coming together as a community and writing these constitutions? And following on from Henrik's comment, in the same way as actually just choosing a legal structure, does that bound the community in a certain way to regulate? I've had a look at what DAOs and cooperatives can learn from one another. That's a working paper that's publicly available on the internet, which I did with some co-authors in a Berkman Klein research sprint. I've also looked at DAOs and data trusts, which is a publicly available working paper online as well. So to your question about co-ops, one sort of standout that really binds the cooperative community is that there are generalizable operating principles, namely around the definition of democracy in these contexts, where those that labor in the cooperative are those that own it. And I think it's worth pointing out that we're having these conversations about DAOs, but they're still a figment in terms of, I think they're extremely evolutionary. They didn't, really exist in practice a couple of years ago. And I think they're rapidly changing. And so not only can DAOs create for themselves kind of more defined principles about what they are, socially or politically, but also technically in terms of technical standards, to go back to what Henrik was saying about what is sufficient decentralization, but also regulators need to think about the ways that they're rapidly evolving. And Henrik mentioned in his last answer as well about agents and how do you determine, unique, separate identities that are operating in these systems that aren't going to collude. Well, we're just seeing the very beginnings of, auto GPTs and these kind of service-oriented AIs. That's a burgeoning area of research for me on regulation and accountability and self-regulation, and actually doing ethnographic research into how DAOs are utilizing ChatGPT type services and capabilities to govern, and whether that creates accountability or not. I guess I'll caveat the point on data trusts that, again, that relates to a completely different type of DAO. That's, data services, data marketplaces, where DAOs are kind of reaching for a legal wrapper, really, to cover what they're doing. And there are data DAOs that have incorporated through that. And I'd point people to look up the example of Superset, which was a few points just to reinforce. The first is that, decentralization to these communities is also a political objective, and it's around self-regulating. I don't fully necessarily subscribe to that, to Henrik's point. I do have some writing on this concept, which I call self-infrastructuring, which relates to the socio and technical dynamics of resilience in these communities as well, if anyone is interested in following those threads. Retroactive regulation won't work, not really something that we touched on today, but, very prime, I'm sure, in people's minds about recent events. And then the final point, just that DAOs are evolutionary. They're not in their final state, even if we're saying there are these things that progressively decentralize. So keep an eye out for AI agents in DAO governance and service provision.
Thank you. I learned a lot from you three. Thank you.
Yeah, I'll share a paper in response to that answer, but I did a very deep dive case study into Gitcoin DAO, and now they actually regulate against Sybil attackers who want to create fake identities to garner more of the treasury in the funding mechanism. So that's called governance of algorithms, governance by algorithms. And it's about how they, in a decentralized context, had to create a machine learning pipeline, which is a very centralized process, and actually govern and maintain that function. And that research happened with large thanks to Block Science for access to that case study, and Gitcoin as well. So I'll throw you an answer to read more.